Welcome to mrhorrortale. The following stories are a collection of the most disturbing anecdotes people have shared about the transportation service Uber, in which both drivers and passengers share their most unsettling and otherworldly experiences while navigating the streets of their cities at the dead of night. From mysterious passengers with cryptic destinations to encounters that defy explanation, these stories will make you think twice before hailing your next ride. To ensure you don't miss out on other horror contents, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Story 1. I used to drive drunk very often. I was young, had recently gotten my first car as a birthday present, and had just started my first semester in college. Not a great combination for a reckless idiot like me. I don't know how, but I came out unscathed every single time. Guess it was just pure luck, but I started getting cocky and driving back home drunk basically every single weekend. It was just a matter of time. Streets were very slippery that day. It'd been raining nonstop, and that combined with my delayed reactions got me losing control of my vehicle and crashing headfirst into a Chevrolet Spark. Got completely totaled. I came out mostly unharmed, but the other driver didn't make it. Young guy too, a year younger than me, just starting in my same college. I still have his parents' faces burned in my mind. I ended up serving 10 years for vehicular manslaughter. Came out around 2 years ago. I regret everything about that night. I'm still trying to make my peace with it. However, after the events of some nights ago, I don't think I'll ever manage to leave it behind me. I went out with a friend the other night, one of the few I still have left. We went out to get something to eat, but it was already pretty late. I guess I should have seen it coming that he'd want to hit a bar with some other people afterwards. I have a complicated relationship with alcohol now. Despite never having quite hit the point of being an alcoholic, I do realize it was the thing that led me to take the worst decision of my life. So I mostly avoid it. In a social environment like a bar though, after someone offers to get you a beer, well, I just didn't feel like having to explain why I don't drink to a bunch of strangers. It was just that one beer though. I've promised myself to never get drunk again, and I've managed to keep it that way. The night went by, and the friend that had invited me in the first place ended up going home with someone else from the bar. That meant it was up to me to find my way back home. I still have no driver's license, nor do I plan to get a new one for the moment. I've resorted to public transport and Uber to move around. I looked at the time and realized it was far too late to get home by bus. My next one wouldn't be coming until early next day. Therefore, I had no option but to call up an Uber. The app began searching for drivers. 2 minutes passed, and it kept on searching. Strange, I thought, as it was a weekend, and the bar we were in was located in a pretty popular nighttime spot in town. Still, I waited. 5 minutes had gone by already, and the app was still searching for available drivers. Annoyed, I closed the app, thinking it might have just crashed. As soon as I did, though, I got a notification claiming a driver had accepted the trip. I tapped on it, and the app opened up again, showing a driver already heading up towards my location. The arrival was in 10 minutes, so I paid my tab, said bye to the remaining people, and headed to wait outside. As the driver got closer, I checked the app to see what car I should look for. The driver's name was, for some reason, just listed as driver. Like where the name usually is, the word driver was written. No photo, either. Unusual, sure, but to be honest, my city is relatively safe, so it's not like it made me hesitant. I just assumed it probably was another weird glitch of the app. The model and plate number were there, which was honestly all I needed. When I checked those, though, that's what threw me off a bit. The model was a Chevrolet Spark. Grim coincidence for sure, but it couldn't have been more than that. The plate number, though, I could be remembering wrong, but it just seemed, if not the same, at least awfully familiar. I didn't have too much time to try and make sure, as the car pulled up in the driveway a moment later, and I almost dropped my phone when I looked at it. The color was the exact same, a dark gray. Getting a bit paranoid, I tried to take a look at the driver's window, but the night was awfully dark, and I couldn't see anything from a distance. Feeling stupid, I breathed deeply and approached. No reason to make a fuss about a string of coincidences. I opened the back door and got in. Without saying anything, the driver took off. I sat there, silently, eager to get home as this creeping dread began to consume me. I was trying harder and harder to push it away, attributing it to my guilt and the stupid car's model, but everything felt so awfully wrong. The driver hadn't said a word the entire trip, and I couldn't even get a good look at him. The rearview mirror had been slightly angled upwards, and I didn't want to get up and check him out, like a creep. At some point, though, I realized he wasn't driving me home. He'd taken a completely different route, and I couldn't recognize the road around me. I tried asking about it, but got no answer. Deeply on edge by now, I asked him to stop the car immediately, but still didn't get any answer. I tried to call the police, send someone my location, but my phone was completely dead. I began screaming, trying to threaten the man, but unable to hide the shakiness in my voice. I got up to try and grab him, and was only met with an empty driver's seat. In that moment, the car stopped. Baffled, I looked everywhere, but the driver had completely vanished. I tried to open the doors, but every single one was locked. I looked out the window to try and ask for help, and recognized the place. It was the same street where the crash had happened. Completely terrified, I began kicking one of the windows when I saw a car approaching at an insane speed. I kept on desperately kicking, and as the car got closer, I realized it had no intentions of stopping. I could tell it was me who was driving after all. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. The next thing I remember was waking up in the driveway in front of my own apartment. I figured it might have been some fucked up dream at first, or that someone had spiked my drink or drugged me on the Uber or something. Doesn't seem likely anymore though. I still had my wallet and phone with me, and when I asked the friends of my friend, confirmed they'd seen me get into a gray Chevrolet Spark. I don't really know how to explain what happened. It seems like jail time wasn't quite enough punishment. At least, not for him. Story 2. You really get to know people when working as an Uber driver. You see them at their most vulnerable, either when they're drunk, angry, and on a hurry, or trying to deal with an emergency. You become a passive observer, take a glimpse on someone else's life for a little while, and then they're gone, and you'll probably never see them again. Even though you're a complete stranger, most people see you as a non-entity, and thus are much more willing to get themselves into situations which normally they'd avoid at all costs in public. It can be interesting. This intimacy, though, it comes with its costs. It'd been a year since I started working on Uber full-time. Back then, I was already pretty used to it, and even though at first I tried to be very polite and offer a sort of premium service, making conversation, offering to change radio stations and whatnot, I'd come to realize people prefer you to leave them alone during their trip, to keep this wall of anonymity between you and them, so they can deal with whatever they have going on without becoming aware that someone else is in the car with them. If they don't, well, they tend to start conversation themselves. This was such the case on Wednesday night. It must have been the middle of January, since it was cold as hell, and it'd been pouring the entire day. Traffic had been the worst, and it was getting pretty late already. I'd started a part-time job on a grocery store in the morning, so I'd had to shift my Uber hours to a late shift, and I was absolutely ready to call it a day. However, I suddenly got a notification for a trip request, not far away from where I was. Knowing that the later the trip, the more money I make, I decided to take this last one before heading home. The address led me to stop right in front of an old building complex, a few feet away from it, a gated park. That's where my passengers seemed to be coming from, stumbling as they made their way to the car. They both wore black, formal clothing. The man had an all-black suit on, and the woman, a long black nitress with a shawl around her neck that covered most of her face, leaving only her very black eyes uncovered, which were further obscured by a big black hat. As they got closer, I noticed the woman seemed to be completely wasted. She couldn't walk at all. The man was almost dragging her to the car. I immediately got a bad feeling. The man opened the door of the car, greeted me, and dropped the woman in the back seat, in which she promptly collapsed with all her weight. Wanting to make sure this man wasn't taking advantage of a poor, unconscious woman, I asked her if she knew the man. The man began trying to reassure me, claiming there was nothing to worry about, and the woman suddenly interrupted with this incredibly raspy, hoarse voice, and told me it was all fine. I only nodded as I waited for the man to prop the woman's head on his lap and take a seat. Then I began driving. Something about her voice made me feel really uncomfortable. Once already on our way, that's when things began getting worse. First thing I noticed was the smell. It was unbearable. It smelled like a mixture of rotten eggs and piss, and seemed to be coming directly from one of the two. I said nothing, of course. I just opened the window to let myself breathe a little. Then, as I kept on driving with this deep sinking feeling in my stomach, I took a glimpse at the couple and noticed their clothes were completely covered in dirt. I cursed, knowing I'd have to clean those seats thoroughly, but my thoughts kept getting interrupted by their poorly whispered conversation. It would mostly be the man leaning onto her and loudly whispering in her ear, and after a few seconds she'd answer in that raspy voice. There was something really strange about it. It was like hollow, is how I'd call it. It made my hair stand on end. Plus, the bits and pieces of conversation I'd hear, they didn't seem to be speaking in any language, but rather making these hissing, throaty noises. Finally, we made it to their destination, a fancy 3-story house in a very well-off neighborhood. Then man tipped me very generously and tried to remove the head of his partner from his lap, and as he did so, the woman rolled off the seat and fell face first to the floor. He apologized to her and began lifting her up, dragging her out of the car. The whole thing really struck me the wrong way. The woman seemed to be completely unable to carry her own weight, and there was a stiffness to her that was just strange. As he finally managed to get her out and help her stand, her head drooped limply to one side, and the hat fell off to the floor, finally giving me a good look at her face. My whole body tensed. I couldn't process what I was feeling. She was a corpse. Her eyes were gone, leaving only deep, empty sockets. Grayish, putrid skin hung loosely to her face, breaking apart in various places, and her head was covered in several bald patches where her hair was withering away and falling off. The man cursed and tried to tell me something, but I floored the gas pedal and took off. I called the police right after getting home. I gave them a description and told them exactly where I'd picked them up and left them. As I checked the pickup address, I realized it wasn't a gated park where they'd been coming from. It was a cemetery. The police told me the house I'd given them the address to was completely empty when they got there, and that there seemed to be no trace of its owners. That's basically the last I heard of it. I still drive Uber, of course. I need the money. I never take late shifts anymore, though, especially not near cemeteries. Story 3. I've been working as an Uber driver for around 5 years by now. Over time, I've come to learn there's a certain sector of the city where you're better off not taking any passengers from. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, and now, whenever I'm working, I absolutely refuse picking up people from the French Quartier very late at night. Every time I've done so, I ended picking up people that are unsettling. Not unsettling like an aggressive drunk person, but rather more like there's something weird going on with them. Let me get into examples. The first time was some 3 years ago, I think. It was one of my first nights doing Uber so late at night, as my son had been born a few months ago, and now that my wife had to go back to work, someone needed to watch him over in the late mornings and early afternoons. Anyways, I was still getting used to driving around in the darkness and managing the exhaustion, so I guess I could attribute it to that. If it'd been a one-time thing, it wasn't at all. I was heading to pick up a passenger from the outskirts of the French Quartier. It must have been around 12 a.m. already. As I was getting close, I saw the silhouette of a person standing right by the sidewalk. Assuming that was my passenger, since the street was otherwise empty, I began approaching. As I got closer, though, the person began getting further away. I don't really know how to explain it, but it seemed like the closer I drove to the person, the further away it seemed to stand in the distance, their outline never seeming like anything else but a silhouette. Confused, I began driving faster, as if that had somehow helped me catch up to them, but it was completely useless. Frustrated and honestly put off by the whole situation, I pulled over to cancel the trip and simply go back home. As I stopped, not only did I realize there was no signs of the trip I'd accepted in the app, but that somehow I'd been driving non-stop for the past 4 hours. My phone's clock marked 4 a.m., and I had already 3 missing calls from my wife. Baffled, I left my phone aside and stared back at the silhouette I'd been trying to approach. Now, all of a sudden, it seemed to be slowly walking towards my car. I immediately took off without looking back. Those sorts of little incidents would be spaced out with just enough time to make it harder for me to make a connection right away, but just unsettling enough for me to have them always in the back of my mind, especially when I'd have to drive to the area. People who'd just disappear as I pulled over. Weird-looking passengers that gave such horrible vibes that I'd immediately cancel the trip and drive away. Quiet, shy-looking people that make me drive them to these remote parts of the city at like 1 a.m. Yet, for way longer than I should have, I'd still keep on picking people up from there. What can I say? It's a touristy area, and more potential tourist passengers meant more frequent trips to nearby hotels and better tips. Plus, it's not like it'd happen every time. Most were just normal tourists, to be honest. Eventually, though, it just wasn't worth it anymore. I have a wife and a son. Whatever it is that happens there, I didn't want to keep messing with it. My breaking point happened around a year from now. I was, same as last times, driving back to the French Quartier to pick up someone. It wasn't that late yet, around 10 p.m., I'd say, but I was already tense. I had a bad feeling about that night. As I approached, a young woman, wearing all white, with a white handkerchief or bandana tied up around her head, started waving at me to approach. I guessed she was my passenger, so I pulled over. The woman got in and said nothing, just sat there expectantly. She didn't give out any immediate red flags, so I just drove, eager to be over with this as fast as possible. She'd marked a location by the outskirts of town, so it was a pretty long drive. All throughout, she was completely silent. It was eerie. She wouldn't move, wouldn't blink, wouldn't stare at her phone or through the window. Nothing. She was just sitting there, staring blankly in front of her with a neutral expression. I swear she didn't even seem to be breathing. I tried to turn on the radio, to shake off the eerie silence a bit, but it just played static in every single station. That's about the moment I began to regret the trip. I drove faster. She seemed completely unfazed. After a little while, I'd grown used to the silence, and I was letting my mind wander a bit as I looked at the passing road. I decided to take another glimpse at the girl, thinking I may just be overreacting a bit. And I almost had a heart attack. In the exact same spot where the girl had been sitting, in her exact same position, now sat an elderly woman. Her hair, completely white, fell to her shoulders, barely held together by the white handkerchief, and her eyes seemed glassy and lifeless. I pulled over immediately and began questioning the woman, asking who she was and how she'd gotten into my car, when suddenly she began singing. This deep, haunting melody came out of her mouth. It didn't sound like her voice, but rather as if it somehow was coming from far away, chanting lyrics in a language I didn't recognize. Then, slowly, her skin started peeling away. I could do nothing but stare in horror as suddenly this woman's skin and hair began falling off, followed by muscle and then bones, as everything began withering away into dust. A few moments later, there was no trace of the woman left besides pile of dust. I took a taxi home. I got off of my car as fast as I could and ran like a maniac until I was at least a mile away. Then I called a taxi and went home. The next day, as I gathered enough courage to try go get my car back, I was just met with a fine for leaving my car in the middle of a street and not a single trace of the woman in it. Thanks for watching. If you like the stories, remember to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any other true disturbing stories. See you next video.